I'm Carrie Call. I'm the conference minister for Penn Central Conference, and I'm joined here by my staff at Penn Central and also by Bill Worley, conference minister of Penn Southeast. Bonnie Bates and David Ackerman were not able to attend today, and we are recording this. So we will have it available for distribution later and for people to rewatch or find their questions and so forth. As you come on, if you are not muted, please do so. And that will help us with keeping the sound in a reasonable level. We're joined by Erica Dollhopf from the National Setting, who is the director of the Center for Analytics, Research, Data, and Development, CARDD. And they do all the stats for the church. And she's going to present us with some information about Pennsylvania churches. She has some information done by conference and the state as a whole, and some comparisons to national and so forth. And what we're going to do with questions is that if there's a question that has to do with something that she just presented, a question of clarity or something like that, put it in the chat so that we can let her know right away. But the other questions you can put in the chat, we can collect them or hold on to them. She's going to go about 25 minutes, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions and time for conversation. So with that, I think I'm going to just hand it over so we make the most use of our time. So Erica, why don't you take it away?
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me here today. As Dr. Call mentioned, Reverend Dr. Call mentioned, my name is Erica Dollhopf, and I'm the director for the Center for Analytics, Research and Development and Data at the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. And I am particularly excited to be here today because I'm actually from Pennsylvania originally, and although I currently live in Indianapolis, I actually have lived most of my life in Pennsylvania. In fact, I think I've lived in 3 out of the 4 Pennsylvania conferences. I grew up in Butler, Pennsylvania, and I have degrees from Pitt, Lehigh, and Penn State, so I've lived all over the state, and I have lots of family throughout the whole state, so I am just so excited to be here today and speaking with all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my PowerPoint here, so if you'll just give me a moment, I will get that going. All right, I have shared my screen. Are you able to see my shared screen? Okay,
yes.
Thank you. And I'm just going to pull up the chat window so I can see that. And now I will get started. So yes, thank you again for inviting me here today. Like I said, it's a special thrill for me to be here. And today I'm going to be focusing primarily on trends in our local churches, such as some things that we're seeing with membership, worship, and Christian education. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing with authorized ministers, and then I'm going to wrap up talking a little bit about some recent research I've been conducting on congregational vitality. And as mentioned, I'll be looking at this not only from a national level and a Pennsylvania level, but many of these trends have been able to break down by a specific Pennsylvania conference as well. So I just want to give you a couple of brief notes on the data before I dive in. First of all, I want to mention that this is 2020 data. So you might be asking, why are we talking about 2020 data in 2022? Well, I'm sure many of you have had to submit your yearbook data. And so as you may know, our yearbook data actually cuts off at December 31st of the previous year. So currently we are conducting, we're really wrapping up our yearbook data collection for 2021, which is really December 31st, 2021 for that year. So the most recent data we have is actually 2020, since we're still finishing up the process of collecting 2021 data. I also want to note, for those of you who have read the statistical profile and have checked out some of the graphs there, the data I'm presenting here is ever so slightly different than the data in there. So a couple of the figures may be very tiny bit different, and that is because for this presentation, we decided the best way to reflect the data was just to look at active churches. But the statistical profile also includes inactive churches, which are generally churches that are no longer holding worship services, but they are still a church within the UCC. So I just want to note in case you're comparing any figures. The next thing I want to note is just the impact of the pandemic on numbers. Of course, 2020 was, quite the year that we had in the start of the pandemic, and there was often widespread restrictions on in-person attendance, and many churches chose to incorporate safety measures to limit worship or to hold worship just online. So some of our in-person numbers might look a little bit different than we'd seen in other years. We're also collecting virtual worship data, but that's separate from in-person worship data for a variety of reasons that I could get into later if you're interested. And also, I just want to note that because we are still in the pandemic, we don't yet know the long-term impact of the pandemic on our churches and our worship. And so this is just something that we're looking at on an ongoing basis in our office. And I also want to note that as well. Finally, I just want to say thank you to the CARDD staff. The whole staff actually helps to compile the yearbook data every year, and it's a huge undertaking. Like I said, we're actually working on finalizing things right now. I want to give a special thanks to Joshua Tucker and Destiny Heisey in my office who helped to prepare this data specifically for this presentation. And finally, I want to give a huge thank you to all of you who submit your yearbook data every year, because that is the data that allows us to do analyses like this and to really understand what's happening in the church and what our church's needs are. And I know that is a non-trivial undertaking for any of you that has had to compile and submit that data. So I also want to thank you because we depend on those numbers, and I'm really grateful for them. So let's talk a little bit about some local church trends. What I'm going to do is I'm first going to give you a little bit of context, both nationally within Pennsylvania and both in the UCC and beyond the UCC of some trends that we're seeing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the data that we have. So first of all, here's a little bit about where our UCC churches are located in the US. So you can see the geographic distribution of our UCC churches. And most of our churches are located in the Great Lakes region, the New England region, and of course, the Middle Atlantic region where Pennsylvania is. And the Middle Atlantic has about 20% of our UCC members and about 20% of our UCC congregations overall. If you're curious, UCC congregations represent about 1.4% of all US congregations nationally, and about 0.5% of all religious adherents in the US. So here's a little bit more about congregations and members. And as you can see, Pennsylvania actually is a major part of the UCC. Over 10% of both our congregations and members are located in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is actually the top state for both of these things. And so we have 11.8% of all UCC congregations are in Pennsylvania, and 13.4% of all members are located in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, turns out, is actually a really huge part of the UCC. Of course, you may already know that. It might not be surprising since we do have 4 conferences in Pennsylvania. And so here's a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing nationally with membership in congregations, now that we've talked a little bit about where they're located. Similar to other Protestant denominations, the UCC has been experiencing a decline in the numbers of congregations and in members in recent decades. One thing that you can't see from this graph, though, that I think is really important to note, that a lot of this decline actually predates the formation of the UCC. So if we're looking at data from our predecessor denominations, we actually see declines in congregations and in members of these predecessor denominations, even at the start of the 20th century. So some of the trends that we're seeing since the foundation of the UCC actually even have a much longer history. So some of the things that we're experiencing actually go back many generations within the UCC and prior to the UCC. And we're also seeing very similar trends across other mainline Protestant denominations. These are trends in membership. The years here are all a little bit different, but essentially we're seeing a decline in membership across most mainline Protestant denominations over time. And so this is a pattern that we're seeing, not just within the UCC, but more broadly within other church bodies as well. And so one final thing I wanted to share briefly was some Pennsylvania state population trends. Something that, of course, impacts who is coming to our churches and where we're seeing growth is also what our population looks like. And so within Pennsylvania, this is Pennsylvania's generally population trends from 1900 until 2010. You can actually see in a lot of Pennsylvania, there's been fairly static lines of population. We're seeing some growth in southeastern Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania has had some periods of growth in it, but generally the population in Pennsylvania has not grown a whole lot. And so of course that also impacts our churches and who is living in our state and what trends are happening in our state in order to understand what we see happening in our pews. So let's talk a little bit about congregational membership trends now that we've looked at some membership data nationally, over time, and across denominations. So I think the patterns that we've seen over the last 20 years more broadly, Pennsylvania actually reflects in some microcosms of this trend. In each of the Pennsylvania conferences, median congregational membership has declined over the past 20 years, generally between about 25 to 45%, which is really pretty consistent within the general trend within the UCC. So if you're looking at the chart here, you can note the red line on there is actually the overall UCC membership trends or median congregational membership. So actually most of our Pennsylvania conferences have slightly higher median congregational membership than we see at the UCC nationally. Something else I'd like to note is that there hasn't necessarily been a dramatic change in relative membership size, and that the decline has actually been roughly consistent across each of the conferences and looking at the UCC overall, which to me suggests that some of the trends we're seeing aren't really specific to any one particular region, but rather are things that we're experiencing more broadly. So here's a little bit about worship attendance. So for me, one of the things that's most immediately evident in looking at this chart, and I know this is a little bit small, so I'm going to break this down a little bit further in a second, is that Pennsylvania is generally a state of small churches. And that's probably not surprising. Pennsylvania has a particularly high number of small towns. And if you've ever driven through any of the small towns in Pennsylvania, I have certainly driven through a lot in my life. You're likely to see a small cluster of churches in every town, no matter the size. My grandmother actually, for more than 50 years, lived in what was technically an unincorporated village in northwestern Pennsylvania. And it was an itty bitty town, but on the main road, there were still 2 churches there in her town, even though, you know, I think the village might have only had a few hundred people. And so Pennsylvania really is a state mostly filled with small churches, and that's actually very true for the UCC as a whole. So let's dig into some of this data a little bit more specifically. First, starting out with our national trends and our overall Pennsylvania trends, you can see that in Pennsylvania, as in the majority, or in the UCC, the majority of congregations have in-person worship attendance, generally of 50 or fewer people. And I think it's also notable that close to 90% of congregations, both in the UCC overall and in Pennsylvania, generally have worship attendance of 100 or fewer people every week. Now, if we look at this broken down by each of the Pennsylvania conferences, we do see a few different trends. The main one being that Penn Southeast actually has a particularly high proportion of smaller churches by worshiping size compared to the other conferences in Pennsylvania. But overall, both measured by membership and by worship, we can see that generally our congregations are small congregations. And I often say that the UCC really is a church of small churches. Because as we saw, this is also generally the pattern we see nationally. Next thing I was going to talk about are some trends in Christian education. So I'm going to talk about both enrollment and participation, but I have them on different slides because otherwise I thought the charts are going to be a little bit too small to see. So similar to what we saw in some of our membership patterns, there have been some overall declines in Christian education worship or Christian education enrollment over the last 20 years. Although I would note some of the declines here are a little bit sharper. So in many cases, we're seeing around 50% or more of decline in Christian education enrollment. And if we're looking at attendance, we actually see this looks pretty similar. Of course, the numbers are a little bit lower because attendance is generally always lower than enrollment. So we're seeing, you know, of course, over time, smaller numbers, although I'd point out that these numbers actually weren't particularly high to begin with. And in many ways, this is probably not surprising that this is what our averages are, given that many of our churches have worship of 50 or fewer people every week. And that gets me to my next slide, which I think will give some, yes.
Erica, sorry. Can we back up just for a second?
Absolutely.
Do you have a sense of the the cause of that wave pattern there, where there's a rise in 2010?
That's a good question. I'm not actually sure. So we've looked at this in our office, and we're not entirely sure why that there is a rise and then a decline again. That's a question that we're still trying to answer, but yeah, I appreciate that being noted, because we're not entirely sure why that's occurred.
Interesting, thank you.
So a little bit, what's interesting about your last question is that even though we see a rise, one of the things that's actually been pretty static over the last 15 years, and this is looking at the data nationally, if you look at worship attendance compared to Christian education attendance, that ratio has actually been pretty steady since about 2005. And so the reason why we are looking at that particular measure is, even though we know that Christian education and worship don't always occur on the same days, don't always include the same people, and aren't necessarily at similar times, we know that this is still often the case for many congregations. So you might have two services and have Christian education opportunities in between, or there might be a service earlier in the morning and then there's Christian education opportunities after the coffee hour. So because we know these are often held in ways that make it easy to attend both, we've been looking at this ratio to try to understand, essentially approximately who's showing up to both. And that's actually been pretty consistent, even though we've seen some declines in the numbers. It's just under 1/3 people. The same number of people, might not be the same people, but the same numbers of people are showing up to, a third are showing up to Christian education compared to worship. And that's been pretty steady since about 2005. So the last church trend I was going to talk about today are some trends we're seeing in churches with the open and affirming designation. Overall, Pennsylvania generally has proportionally fewer O&A churches than the UCC nationally. Currently, nationally, the UCC is at about 34%. And within Pennsylvania, that number is, the highest number is about 18%, and that ranges within there. But if this is something that your congregation is discerning, there's some things I wanted to note from a study that we actually did of O&A congregations in 2019. So one thing that we found is, so I also want to note the reason why the numbers here are 2014 to 2018 is that we first started tracking this data in the Data Hub in 2014. So this was the range of years that we were able to look at with the data that we had. But we found that compared to non-O&A churches, O&A churches did tend to have larger memberships. They experienced less loss of membership. I know that sounds a little bit funny. The reason why I'm phrasing it that way is that we know overall from seeing our previous charts that membership in churches is declining, but churches that are O&A actually are experiencing decline of membership at a slower rate, essentially. O&A churches experience fewer closures and mergers, and they also tend to have substantially higher budgets than non-O&A churches. Now, I do want to note that this is correlation and not causation. So it's very possible that these were the characteristics that churches had before they went into the O&A process. But this is something that I'm mentioning. If this is something that your church is thinking about or discerning, the O&A Coalition reported in our 2021 statistical profile that they're actually seeing an increase in rural churches undergoing this discernment process. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about this study, which we actually conducted at the request of the O&A Coalition a few years ago, that's on our website, ucc.org/research in our statistics and reports section. So now I'm going to change focus a little bit and talk about some of our authorized minister trends. And today I'm going to focus on the age of our authorized ministers. So as far as our authorized minister age distribution, and I would mention that these are actually our non-retired authorized ministers, we see fairly similar patterns both in Pennsylvania and nationally. Overall, half or more of our authorized ministers are over 60. Approximately a quarter of our clergy are in the 50 to 59 age range, and the last quarter of our clergy are about under 50, with some variations by conference. You can see that Penn West actually has a higher proportion of clergy 70 and older than some of the conferences, but actually the rest of their numbers essentially fall in line pretty closely with what the patterns we see in the other conferences. One interesting thing to note, though, is on average, our median clergy age is actually a little bit lower in Pennsylvania than what it is nationally. So that might be a little bit hard to believe, but actually our clergy in Pennsylvania are slightly younger than what we would see if we look at all the clergy nationwide. However, I want to talk a little bit about ordination trends and some of the age distribution that we have there to give you some better context for this. So Elizabeth Dilley, who is the team leader for the MESA team at the national setting, did a really wonderful analysis last year for a statistical profile looking at age at time of ordination. And what we found is that people are entering the ministry at all ages. And we're seeing it's been more common that people are entering the ministry as a second or third career. So we see clergy, you know, at all sorts of different ages entering the ministry. But Elizabeth did note in her report that the biggest age group of people being ordained are people in the 30 to 39 age range. So one of the things that we found that while there are a lot of older clergy in the UCC, we continue to have people entering the ministry pipeline at all ages. And something else I want to note about ordination data that you wouldn't necessarily know from looking at this chart is that, and something that if you ever compare statistical profiles, you may see variations in, is that ordination data is something that doesn't necessarily get entered in at the same time that the rest of our congregational data is entered every year for the yearbook. And sometimes it takes a couple of years for ordination records in our database, the data hub, to actually be updated. So I would say it probably takes us about 2 or 3 years to fully collect all the data on all the ordinations that might have occurred in a given year. And so it always looks a little bit lower on the most recent year, in this case 2020, than it probably ultimately is. That number is actually probably going to go up when we pull it again this year for the statistical profile for 2020. We do expect that there was probably some pandemic impact on ordinations, and partially because people, you know, weren't necessarily able to get together in person. So I don't know what impacts you're going to see in 2021 when we look at this data. But I do want to note that our ordination charts actually look a little bit like this every year in terms of there being lower numbers from the last preceding year or two. And that's just an artifact of how the data is collected. But overall, like I said, we have people of all ages being called into the ministry, and that's something that we celebrate. And Carrie, I see you might have a question.
Well, I just wanted to note that 2019 and 2020 were under 100. And my sense is that if we were to take this line back to the year 2000, that we'd see a decline trend in the number of people being ordained. Is that accurate? Because under 100 is not very many.
Yes, I believe it has declined over time. As we update the data, like I said, the decline usually doesn't look as steep, but I think the number certainly has gone down in the last 20 years.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the last thing I'm going to talk about today is congregational vitality. And that's because I would like to talk about some things that I think, even though we've looked at some numbers that might be challenging to look at and some trends that might be difficult to see, I still think there's a lot of hope and promise in the church. And some of the research I've been conducting lately gives me a lot of reason to still be excited about the church of the future, even though it may not look the same as the church that we know today and the church we've known in the past. So the United Church of Christ has been part of an interfaith congregational survey called Faith Communities Today that's been conducted nationwide about every 5 years since 2000. And most recently, we conducted the survey in 2020. And we actually sent this survey out to every single church in the UCC. So if you filled that out, thank you, because this data is really critical because it collects a lot of data that we actually don't collect every year for the yearbook. And this data also helps us understand trends in the UCC compared to other faith groups, and really just get a sense of what's happening in religious communities around the United States nationwide. And so I've often received questions about congregational vitality, and that's an area that you know, people are starting to research and understand what does it look like. And so with the Faith Communities Today data, I was actually, I thought to myself, you know, can I conduct a study on congregational vitality? So one of the things, of course, that's a little bit challenging about trying to study congregational vitality is that there's actually a lot of different ways to look at congregational vitality, because there's different types. So you have community vitality, which is, your congregation in relationship to its community. Internal relational vitality, which is how your congregation's relationships are with each other on the inside. Organizational vitality, so how does your church as an organization function, and does it function in a healthy way? And then spiritual vitality, so is your church members, do they feel spiritually vital and alive, and do they feel nourished spiritually by their church? And these are all important parts of congregational vitality, but of course they're all a little bit different. And so I found in the questions that we asked in the Faith Communities Today survey, a lot of them actually pointed at these 4 main different types of congregational vitality. So I tried to see statistically if I could create a scale that made sense. And essentially what I did is there's some analyses that you can do to see if different questions are actually pointing to one larger underlying concept. And I found that these items were. So all the ones that you see here on the right were questions that we asked of churches where they rated on a scale of 1 to 5, things like, does your church have a clear mission and purpose? Is your church willing to change to meet new challenges? And so what I did is I actually took these responses. So 5 was strongly agree and 1 was strongly disagree. And I created this into a scale for each of our respondents. And I found that actually there's a measure you can use to see, does this scale make sense? Does it have internal reliability? And I found it actually had extremely high internal reliability. So I decided to use this variable basically as a measure of overall congregational vitality. And I use this in a model to try to understand, well, if we have this number of congregational vitality, what are the things that predict churches having higher or lower numbers? So then I looked at some of the literature, and both things that have been written about within the UCC and in broader studies of congregational vitality over time. And I also incorporated a couple of items that are things that, I hear from churches that they've tried in order to increase congregational vitality. Specifically, some churches try to see if they can have more young adults be part of their worship service and part of their congregational life. And some churches have tried to use contemporary worship as a way to attract more people. So I was also interested in testing that to see how do those items correlate with congregational vitality. So these are the items that I tested, and trying to see what would overall correlate with the higher or lower levels of congregational vitality. So after running my models, there's actually 2 things on here that were particularly highly predictive of congregational vitality. And those are the first 2 that are listed on the left-hand side here. So the first one is level of innovative worship. So churches were asked to rate how innovative they felt their worship is, and churches that agreed with that more strongly tended to experience higher levels of congregational vitality. Now I want to mention, well, worship mean? That actually is going to mean something different for every congregation, and that's something that's going to be authentic to what is innovative in your congregation. So for some congregations, this may be having worship at different times, different locations. This may be different in what's incorporated in your worship. It might mean something different for every congregation, but congregations that felt that they were pursuing higher levels of innovation in worship also were those that reported experiencing higher levels of congregational vitality. The second one that had the biggest effect size was actually the fit between the pastor and the congregation. So congregations that reported higher levels of feeling that there was a good fit in congregation were actually those that reported some of the higher levels of congregational vitality. So I want to note that is something that our churches, have always sought to do and continue to seek to do, and that's actually one way that churches really can impact their overall congregational vitality. At least looking at this on the aggregate. Of course, everyone's experiences are different, but on the whole, this seems to actually have a pretty big effect on congregational vitality. And then I want to note a few things that actually had no effect on overall congregational vitality, at least in this model, is that the percentage of young adults actually had no impact. So churches that had a really high level, really low level, that didn't matter. Level of contemporary worship didn't matter. And I want to mention that in context of innovative worship. For some churches, innovative worship could mean including contemporary worship, but if that's not authentic to your church, innovative or contemporary worship in and of itself doesn't actually impact overall congregational vitality. So that's something that had no effect. Something else I want to note is congregational age. I've heard some congregations before be concerned that only new congregations can be vital congregations, and we found that was actually not the case. Didn't matter what your founding year was. We have some very old congregations that are extremely vital. And then I also finally want to note that the 5-year percentage change in worship attendance was something that I put in. So I looked at for these churches, if there was a difference in, have you had an increase in worship attendance, if you had a decrease, and that actually didn't matter either. So it wasn't so much if churches were growing or shrinking, or if they were in perfect financial health or they weren't. These weren't actually the things that mattered. And so in the studies of congregational vitality, there's a researcher who used to conduct research for the ELCA that said that the way she thought about congregational vitality was thinking about how churches connect with each other, how they connect with God, and how they connect with the world. And I think this is actually reflected in what we see in UCC churches, is that the things that can make your church vital are actually how you connect with each other and with your community around you. It's not necessarily whether you're growing or shrinking, or you have any one particular type of worship, or your church is old or new. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope in what that the things that we can do to make ourselves vital are right in front of us, and can often just involve connecting with each other and the communities that we're in. So I wanted to share that as well. Yes, Carrie.
A question was raised about what's the difference. Sorry, just got bumped. What's the difference between the number of participants and percent change in worship attendance?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So number of participants, the way this is measured, and part of the reason that this is phrased this way, because I mentioned that this is an interfaith survey. And so we actually met, and because every different religious group defines membership differently, we asked a question about approximately how many people regularly participate in the life of your church over the last month. And the reason why I think the number of participants, it wasn't a very highly significant variable, but I think some of that is actually relates a little bit to not so much size, but rather church capacity. Because if you've ever been in a church with volunteers, you know that sometimes you need a critical mass of volunteers in order to get certain programs going, or you need enough people to be able to, organize a program or conduct a program. So I think there's actually some further analyses I'd like to do with that to see if there's actually a certain inflection point at which you just need enough people in order to organize the kind of work in the church that works for vitality. But essentially, participants are the people who might be coming for any type of church programming, whether it's Christian education, a volunteer opportunity, and worship attendance is actually just people who show up to worship. Yes.
The material that you have, I'm assuming that you do a deeper dive into it, and there's a question about whether some of this material will be available in more granular form, I guess.
Yes, actually, I published a paper on it in October. There was, so all of us that are part of the Faith Communities Today research group, we were asked by the journal Theology Today if we could actually take over one of their issues and write articles from each of our faith traditions about what was going on. So that was published in October, and currently, I think you might have to watch the webinar that we conducted in order to download the article, but based on Theology Today's copyright, I think we're going to be able to publicly release everything this October, because they asked us to not distribute it for 1 year unless they were the ones distributing it, and then it's going to be publicly available. So the short answer is yes, there's a very deep dive that's out there, and this is the short version of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that is actually what I have for this data. And so I'm really happy to answer your questions, and I appreciate your time and attention for the data that I presented so far.
Before we go anywhere with any, if people have questions, just a baseline question, which is, will we have the slides available for people to be able to review? Can we do that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that.
Okay, great.
In fact, I'll make myself a note right now.
Okay, so I know that Amelia had a question. Amelia, do you want to start off?
Sure, thank you. Amelia Price, Central Pennsylvania. I'm curious about the statistic regarding clergy age and how that relates to the median age in Pennsylvania and how that affects the data that you're describing to us.
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I'm going to share my screen again. I don't have, I have a little bit actually on age, both nationally and by region. So let me share that again. Okay, so I think one of the things we're seeing, not just with clergy but also with our congregational membership, is that on average, the people in these categories are getting older. So the people in our pews are a little bit older, and our clergy are a little bit older. But some of that's actually just reflecting our general population trends we've seen in the United States. So generally, the US is getting older, and we have a higher proportion of older adults than we've ever had before. This actually only goes up to 2000 because I couldn't find a copy of the graph that I was satisfied with that went beyond that. But I believe the trends from everything I've read from the census are still extremely similar. And so in many ways, it's not surprising that we have the average age of the clergy has gone up over time, in part because we have more older adults in the US, also because our life expectancy has gone up. And so people tend to be working later than they used to, even 20 or 30 years ago. Relatedly, I know I talked about young adults with congregational vitality, and something that I think is also important to mention from a population standpoint is that there's actually proportionally fewer young adults in the United States than there's ever been before. So sometimes when I'm asked the question of, where are the young adults, one of the things to remember is that we actually don't have the age distribution in the US that we did when the UCC was founded. And so that's part of, I think, some of the impact. I did not find in my brief look, I did not find Pennsylvania specific data in a chart that I could readily put in, but I did find regional age groups. And this is looking at 2000 to 2010 and then 2010 to 2020. And the darker bars at the bottom here are under 18. The lighter bars are over 18. And essentially what we're seeing is what, in the Northeast, at least where Pennsylvania would be located, we're seeing similar trends in that the population is, our older population is growing, our younger population is actually shrinking. And so I imagine that's part of the reason why we're seeing not only older clergy, but also older members. But I also would imagine that probably what we define as retirement age, that's probably also changing. And I recognize that that can be for a variety of reasons. Sense of call, I think, is part of it. Finances might be part of it. My father's actually a retired ELCA minister, and I know he retired, but he still supplies and he still preaches, and he's well into his 70s. And so I know that retirement also for clergy and what it means to be an active minister probably looks different for clergy than it does for other different professions. And so I think that's also something that we're seeing as well.
Thank you very much.
So let's open to other questions, comments. I know the material was presented quickly. You will have a chance to look over it at your own pace. But what are some of the things that stand out to you with some of the trends that we've seen or that concern you? Go ahead and, since I can't see the whole gallery, you can raise your hand with the hand raising thing at the bottom, or you can just jump in. Go ahead, Jane.
Okay. Yes. Well, I was just interested in, since I'm serving on COM, the age of ordination. And I'm wondering, there was a statistic for, it was about 20% of the ordinations would be 60 and older. Is there any breakdown of the 60 and older group? I mean, are we ordaining people in their 70s or their 80s?
That's a good question. Actually, let me see if I have that really quickly in the statistical profile. And if not, we've been over time reconsidering what age ranges we use in the statistical profile, so we can offer a more fine-grained analysis. So let me see if I have that really quickly. I have that pulled up right now. Off the top of my head, I don't know that we actually do have that broken down further. See.
It would be interesting if it were.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, no, we don't have this in here, but I'm going to drop in chat the link to our 2021 statistical profile, from which some of this data is taken. And so feel free to look through that. This is reports on churches, clergy, and also special reports from around the life of the UCC. And so this is something we produce every year.
Okay, I'm going to go to Martha, and then we've got one out of the chat, and then we'll go to Joel. So go ahead, Martha.
Erica, your statistics were very, very good in describing the vital congregations and the characteristics, but I'm trying to process in my mind, put it all together. Do you have in your mind, having studied all this, what the any one particular congregation that you know of, and could you describe that kind of? Or do you know of a particular congregation or churches that are like that contain all these elements?
Well, I think it's, because so many of these elements are going to be really specific to what that church is, and what's authentic to that church. I think it's hard to describe any one particular church, but what I do imagine it would look like is a church that, is, very connected with each other as well as their community. One thing that we talk about with the innovation work we do is if your church, disappeared tomorrow, would your community notice? And what I'm noticing from churches that feel like they have a lot of energy and vitality is that they are connected with their community. They're making connections. They're looking, they take care of the people within the church, but also they look to the people outside of their church as well. And so that's my hunch for what is one of the things that really helps our churches to be vital and stay vital, and really to be, a central part of their community.
So there's a question, Erica, that came up in the chat. Is there a connection in terms of vitality and church purpose and so forth? What is the connection between adult participation in faith formation or Christian education involving scriptural study or small group discussion on a variety of topics, or involvement with discipleship building activities such as the walk to Emmaus? Does the vitality, did you see any connection with that kind of adult Christian ed, for lack of a better term, engagement?
I didn't look specifically at the impact of adult and Christian ed engagement, but one of the factors for vitality was actually, and so that would all be included in spiritual vitality, and if your church feels that it's spiritually vital and alive. And I know that not studies that not that I have done, but some of my colleagues have done, talk a lot about the importance of spiritual vitality within congregations. And so I'd imagine that all of those things actually would be very important to cultivating spiritual vitality within a congregation, which of course is an important part of overall congregational vitality. And so there's a lot of statistical reasons that I have not yet broken that down, in part because the different pieces of vitality are so closely related to each other. It's hard to model them separately, actually, because they all they start basically not playing nice in your models is the simple way to put it. But it would be exactly things like that that I think really contribute not only to spiritual vitality, but also internal relational vitality. Because I know in church, that's, in groups like that, that's where I develop my deepest connections with people. And that's where I really feel most closely connected with others. So I imagine that those types of things would actually be very important.
Okay. Go ahead, Joel, and then we'll do another from the chat.
Okay, thank you. I guess continuing the trend on looking at ministers retiring and seeing that as the back door, you already talked about the front door percentage of people coming into ordination and the age between 30 and 39%. I can imagine that you have some sort of visibility on any kind of trend as far as comparing the number of people coming in to ordination and those leaving ministry, whether retiring or leaving ministry or going inactive. Mm-hmm. Is there any observations you can make? I assume we're shrinking, the numbers are getting smaller, but that's just an assumption from observation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because actually compared to our rate of, I guess, member loss and congregational loss, our numbers of clergy have actually been fairly stable. And so if you're looking at both retired and non-retired clergy. We have a page in the statistical profile where we actually map this out over time. And since 1992, we've had about a 50% reduction in membership, approximately a 25% reduction in congregations, but only about a 5% reduction in clergy. Now, some of those clergy are retired, and we're actually at about the threshold in the UCC where we have about as many retired clergy as non-retired clergy. But what we're effectively seeing is that actually, because we have so many clergy, but not as many congregations, I think sometimes what is happening is that there's, the jobs that might used to be in certain locations where that people would, full-time calls, those aren't always necessarily available at the same rate that they were because congregations are getting smaller. We're seeing a lot more shared leadership, yoked congregations. And so I think what's actually happening is that the way people are engaging in a pastoral career look a little bit different. We're seeing increases in bivocational ministry, whether it's by choice or by circumstance. And actually, we're working on a report right now within CARDD on that and some trends from the Faith Communities Today data that we're seeing in the UCC. But overall, actually, we have not seen the same decreases in clergy as we've seen in members and congregations.
So there's a question about if we're a church of small churches, which we are, has any work been done on defining the size of those small churches and vitality? For instance, we have roughly 20 people in worship, but a much smaller number of people able or interested in working, working within the church. That leaves us with few available to live out our dreams. So is there a threshold size or a tipping point in terms of vitality and actual size when we're talking very small congregations?
I don't know of any research that looks specifically at that, but I can tell you a little about, I appreciate the question, and I recognize that if you have 20 people in a church that are showing up, say, to worship, that doesn't really tell you anything about what the church is doing exactly. What kind of groups are they hosting? What kind of work are they doing in the community? And so one of the things that we're actually working on in our office that I think will help us understand this question of what does vitality specifically in small churches look like is we're trying to find ways to actually measure that and figure out, it could be a church of 20 people, but they host a dinner for 100 people every month. It could be a church of 20 people, but they're actively trying to help resettle a refugee family, and that's, they're leading the community in that. And I think that speaks a lot to vitality in ways that just numbers don't, but we don't actually have a consistent way of necessarily measuring that right now with our current yearbook and data hub data collection. So I don't know if any of you had to fill the supplemental survey this year. One of the questions we actually asked is, what kind of work do you feel best exemplifies what your church does? And we asked that in part because we're trying to figure out, what are ways we can actually measure this? Do we look at, say, the types of groups that you're hosting? If you're hosting, say, like an AA group or Girl Scouts? Is your church hosting things like, do you have a polling station at your church? Do you have different types of ministries where you're, supporting those who are experiencing homelessness or providing, food security in your community? And so we're trying to better figure those things out so we can better describe what churches are doing beyond just what their numbers are. And I think that will also help us to understand what congregational vitality looks like at different congregational sizes.
So Erica, one of the things that you talked about before we started, before everybody came into the room, was about the future trends that have to do with the possibility of mergers and so forth. And we had a question from Bruce about the strategic implications of the data. By strategic, I mean from a higher perspective, there have been mergers of conferences across the UCC. Does this make sense for the Pennsylvania conferences? And that's something that the Pennsylvania conference ministers are talking about. But could you say something about, because that people ask us all the time, what happens 20 years out? And you did have a couple things to say about that when we met earlier. Can you say some of that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, there's a lot of reasons that, conferences or even churches try to merge because there's so much, I think, that goes into a merger that's actually, very organizational and trying to, be a good steward of your resources and good steward of time. I would say that, my PhD is in sociology, and, I studied organizations, but within that I looked at congregations and faith-based nonprofits and social movements. And actually one thing that we see within religious groups is that over time, as we see numbers often start to shrink, and this has been the trend for over 100 years, is we often see mergers of different groups. And I think this probably certainly was part of the UCC's merger into the church that we now have in 1957. So from a long-term trend, that is something that we often see are different types of mergers whenever we see decline in numbers in church bodies. So that's something I imagine we might expect to see just broadly within the US, possibly across different religious bodies, or certainly working more closely with one another. I know within our office, we actually partner quite a bit with our colleagues at the United Church of Canada and also Disciples of Christ for some of the work we're doing, because we like to say, we can't do this all ourselves. But if we work with each other, we can actually do quite a bit and achieve our dreams better than we can on our own. And so I think that's often true for organizations that do have a mission in mind and need a little bit of help to achieve it. And maybe they find people that have a similar mission that can help them along.
There's and this is a painful question in some sense, but there's a question of if there is a great fit between the pastor and the congregation, and vitality may be dependent upon that actor or that fit, because that's one of the things that came up from what you said. What happens when the pastor either retires or leaves and little or no spiritual transformation has occurred? What happens then? And I know that's not necessarily a question for you to answer, but just curious what you think.
Yeah, well, first, I think that, that fit between the pastor and the congregation, I think it's really two ways. It's not just the church is relying on the pastor for vitality. I think it is, that you're working together ideally as a team, and hopefully you have a shared mission and vision in mind. I can say as a graduate student, I published a paper on transitions in congregations whenever you have a leader leave. And so usually and what does that look like? And actually what we found is that the churches that are most resilient after a leadership transition are those that had a pretty solid foundation prior to the leadership transition. So I would say that generally, a church that is trying to plan and sort of aware of their circumstance, that they can, weather kind of different leadership transitions. So if your pastor leaves, and I know this is often easier said than done, but if you, have yourself in a good position and you're well prepared, that's often one of the best things that you can do, even if you have to undergo a change in leadership, to not only be prepared to welcome a new leader in, but I think it's important for a church to discern what direction you're going in. What does your future look like? Maybe that's different than where you were before. But I think while it can be challenging to go through a pastoral change, especially if you didn't see the transformation you wanted, it's also a point that you can regroup and say, well, this direction didn't work in the past. I think this is where we want to go. And how do we find a leader that can facilitate us in that? So usually a church experiences at least a 10 to 15% drop in membership around the time of pastoral transition. And we found that over time, that the best predictor of what your number is 5 years after a transition is what it was right before the transition. Because if you're well prepared and you're able to call a leader that fits with your mission and vision, you're pretty much able to get back to where you were before.
Okay, and keeping an eye on the time, Chuck, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I'm wondering any statistics on trends in terms of the number of congregations in multiple point charges, the number of congregations in ecumenical relationships for pastoral care, and the number of churches in part-time ministry.
That is a great question. And that's something we are starting to look into. I would say we don't really have great data on it yet because that can be difficult to measure, trying to determine exactly which pastors do have multi-point charges. And actually, part-time ministry isn't something we necessarily have consistently reported in the data hub at the moment, at least not enough that we can report out on it. But I have some Faith Communities Today data that we're hopefully going to publish on our site in the next month or two. But effectively, part-time ministry certainly has increased over the last 20 years. That's the short story.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Bill, do you want to say something about your question that you posed about the fruits of the Spirit?
At the risk of launching into a full explanation, no. I think the answer is yes, and I'll just leave it there. The
Okay,
discernment and contemplation of our siblings in Christ.
so Bill's question, for those of you who didn't see it, is how vitality and the fruits of the Spirit might intersect, and maybe making that translation to scriptural sources. Go ahead, Amelia.
I'd like to clarify what I think I just heard you say, because it seems extremely impactful. Did I understand you to say, I'm known as the cuckoo clock person. I apologize. I didn't even see what time it was. Did I understand you to say that the data that you have been describing is based on full-time ministry and does not, I don't want to say effectively, but meaningfully reflect part-time ministry?
No, actually. So what I guess I apologize. Let me clarify. So what is to say that for churches, they can report whether their clergy are part or full-time, and that isn't always necessarily recorded in our data. And so we don't always break it down by part or full-time because we don't always know. But our data does include all pastors, regardless of whether they are part or full-time. So it does reflect all of them. It's just we don't necessarily know if they are all considered part or full-time. But yes, it does include everyone.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Burning questions?
Gary, I will circle
Go ahead,
back
Bill.
around to say one thing. I think it's critically important that first we express gratitude to Erica for the information that she shared with us, and be in discernment about how the information she is sharing with us is about what we are doing in the life of the church and what the Spirit and what God are doing in the life of the church. And I just want to lift up that that it's critically important that as we talk about vitality and changing some of the downward trends, that we're not only talking about what we are going to do, but we're also talking about what God is going to do. And I'm just want to give God the last word here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Bill. So our time is at an end, and thank you so much, Erica, for being here with us and providing all of this amazing information. I do know that once people study the slides in more detail, there will be probably more questions, and maybe we can collect some of those and follow up with you on things. But I'm hoping that this larger picture of where things are in Pennsylvania with the United Church of Christ has been helpful, at least to get you to be doing some thinking about your own settings and the relationships among our various settings. And the vitality stuff I thought was really good for us to be able to see what that looks like, because the fact that the number of young adults doesn't affect it, I still think that's a remarkable thing to learn, because that is very much in the minds of many people in the church, that's what we need more of that in order to get here. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the research that CARDD has done in order to pull this together for us. That's been a wonderful gift to us. So thank you very much. For those of you who are here, thank you for coming. And we will make the recording and the slide deck available as soon as we can, and we'll have that posted through the various conferences. So thank you again, Erica, so much. This has been incredibly valuable. Appreciate it tremendously. And blessings on the rest of your day. Don't forget, we have Lenten prayer at noon if anybody wants to come to prayer. Ms. Nora Faust is leading us today. So 20 minutes of prayer at noon. All right. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.